What's going on, everyone? This is Tyrone May here, Himalaya ride enthusiast and entrepreneur. I'm back again to bring you chapter 5 from my book, The Himalaya, where the strobe flashes and the mirror ball spins. Basically, my story is about my story on how my fascination with the Himalaya ride started, which leads me to my journey to one day call one of those classic rides of my very own. If you'd like to purchase your copy, you can get it on Amazon or on my online store. You can also get some Himalaya fan-based merch. Web address is shown below on the screen. So without further ado, I will proceed with chapter 5, titled Change of Scenery. A year later, after a long cold winter, I was constantly talking about my favorite ride and how I wanted to someday have one of my very own. My stepfather suggested me that I should start saving up some money so I could buy one myself someday. He told me that if I started doing things around the house, he would give me $5 every week, and if I kept doing that for a while, I could eventually save enough money for my own Himalaya. I already knew that it would take me decades to save enough money for something so big and expensive, but I was willing to save enough to give the solution a try. So that following week, I worked my fingers to the bone, doing every single thing I could think of, just to get my hands on my first $5 bill to save. However, this idea obviously didn't last too long because during that following week, I saw a commercial of a new toy that just came out and I had to have it. I wanted to stick with my plan, so I started thinking about my dream Himalaya ride, until one day I went with my mother to run some errands and I saw that new toy. I wanted my mother to get it for me, but she told me that if I wanted to get it, I had to spend my $5, which I was supposed to be saving for my ride. I had to make a decision to either go with my original plan to save enough money for my own Himalaya ride, which would take me years, or this new toy that I would probably play with for a week and then forget about. But my weak 8-year-old mind just couldn't take it anymore. I ended up going with the new toy instead, and man, did I regret it in the end, and I still do to this day. A month later, school was letting out for the summer vacation, and I was already talking about the fair. It wasn't even July yet. Some of my friends went to day camps for the summer, and some just stayed home like I did. During the summer, I usually went to a babysitter, but this time with my new younger brother Cameron, I would be at my mother's job, which was at a beauty salon that was located in the mall at the time. When I went to my mother's job, sometimes she would give me a couple of bucks for the arcade that was 2 shops down from our job, where I spent most of the day. As soon as I ran out of money, I'd go back to the shop where my mother worked, or sometimes when I got bored, I'd go to one of the swiveling chairs and swing around, playing with the lever that raises and lowers the chair. I pretty much made it a ride because I was lifting myself up in the chair and spinning myself silly. It was the only way I could entertain myself. That was until my mother told me in her own words to knock it off. July finally arrived, and it was time to get ready for the Delaware State Fair. I counted the days, and I dreamt almost every night about going on my favorite ride. I once had a strange dream. I was watching the fair being set up, which I hadn't seen in reality. But in this dream, I went to the Himalaya at its usual spot, where it was halfway set up when I arrived at the fairgrounds. Oh, and by the way, it was nighttime, which was pretty unusual. I guess I was used to going to the fair at night, so in a way my mind automatically played along with it. After having such an unusual dream, I was ready to go back to the fair as soon as possible. On television, or usually during the local news, there would be an advertisement about the Delaware State Fair, which had me glued to the television for the 30 seconds the commercial ran. On that first opening night of the fair, I was talking about going back to the Himalaya the entire time. Not the fair, just the Himalaya. Earlier that day, I went with my mother to her job. She just bought a newspaper that morning, and she showed me a big article about the state fair and all the rides and different events it would have that year. On one part of the article, I had a list of all the different rides printed out like there was sign lettering. As I looked at the ride list, I saw ride names like Skydiver, Flying Bobs, Gravitron, and yes, even the Himalaya, with this famous cursive lettering with that star dotting the I in its name. When I received that paper, I didn't care about going to the arcade that day or anything else. I just wanted to look at that article all day and go to that fair. After we came home from the mall, one of my friends, George, came by and we played outside to kill some time before we all left to go to the fair later that evening. My mother and I left the house around 7 o'clock that evening and started to head over to my grandmother's house to drop off my brother Cameron and to see if she wanted us to bring her some peanuts from the fair. And Christine wanted to come along with us, so she met us at my grandmother's and tagged along. After taking some time to get ourselves ready to go, I suddenly blurted out, "Come on, the Himalaya waits!" As soon as I said that, everyone just laughed. Finally, we started heading to the car and started towards Harrington on our way to the fairgrounds. After a few more pit stops, we finally arrived to the brightly lit Midway. While my mother looked for a good parking spot, I, of course, was too busy looking for the Himalaya. As soon as we got closer, there it was in its usual place. I was excited, but I also had butterflies, just like every year. We got out of the car and started heading towards the Midway, and the first ride I always laid my eyes on was the mighty Himalaya. As I approached the ride, I looked at the painted scenery on the outside of the ride. I looked up at the side of the ride and watched all the sleigh-shaped cars whistling by, along with the siren wailing over the loud bass-filled music. I looked at the Himalaya and smiled from ear to ear as I happily sighed, "Welcome back." As I watched the Himalaya and listened to the DJ, I admired his microphone skills. We started walking down the Midway. The fair had a couple of new rides that were making their debuts that year. The first new ride I rode was called the Wave Swinger, which I've seen during my previous trip to Hershey Park. This one, however, takes you a little higher thanks to its high-rising platform the ride stood on. The main part of the ride tilts and undulates as it spins. After the ride in the swings, we started walking down the Midway to see what other new features the State Fair of 1988 had in store. As we walked further, we saw the Spider ride, which I had started riding that previous year. I started to head to the Spider. This time my mother volunteered to ride it with me. As usual, the ride started slowly, then it started to tilt in various directions as we spun around freely in our cars. I was having fun, but my mother was just losing her mind. She started screaming and carrying on while I was on there just listening to her and saying to myself, what was I thinking to let her on this ride with me? As soon as the ride ended, I was ready to ride something else to get my mind off the experience I just had with my mother during my ride on the Spider. As the night started winding down, it was time for me to make my way over to the Himalaya. We started walking towards the ride, but this time I had Aunt Christine ride the Himalaya with me. We started to get in line and we waited for our turn. The moment finally arrived and we started walking up the steps. The worker showed us to our seat and it was business as usual. The Himalaya started backwards, then forwards as the loud rock music blasted from the sound system, along with the lights flashing, the siren wailing, and the ride operator performing its usual routine as the Himalaya whirled us around at top speed. Suddenly, the ride began to slow down as the ride ended. After the ride on the Himalaya was over, it was time to call it a night. Before we left the fair, we made a detour to some of the concession stands to purchase some cotton candy, candy apples, and some peanuts for my grandmother. We began to leave the Midway and started heading to the car. I took one last look over at the Himalaya until I made my next visit to the fair. A few days later, I was hanging with my father for the day as he came back in town from the Air Force, and he started making plans for us to take a trip to the fair during the last 2 days on that following weekend. I was thrilled and I couldn't wait because I would be going to the fair 2 times in a row, which would be a first for me. The day finally came and I couldn't wait until my father came home to take me to the fair on the first of the final 2 nights. Earlier that day, he called the house and told me that he was going to stop by around 7 o'clock that evening to pick me up, which was okay with me because my younger cousin Nisha was stopping by for the day, which was great because we could play around all day and it would kill some time. Later that evening, I was getting dressed and ready for my father to pick me up to take me to the fair. Finally, 7 o'clock struck, but as I looked out the window, my father wasn't there yet. I figured he was running a little late, so I didn't worry that much. But an hour later, he still hadn't showed up, so I started to get upset because things like this normally wouldn't happen. My father finally called the house around 9 o'clock that evening and explained what happened to him. He apologized for his absence and told me that he would definitely make it up to me as he made big plans for the next day. He did just that. He picked me up early Saturday afternoon and had made plans for the entire day. First, we went to the aquarium in Baltimore, Maryland, and bowling afterwards, and then ended our day with the fair on this last evening in Harrington, Delaware. Before we headed to Harrington, we made a detour to Milford to pick up some of my cousins on my father's side of the family to come to the fair with us. We picked up my 3 cousins, Lorena, Toya, and Cindy, and started making our way to the fairgrounds. As we headed towards Harrington, I started going on and on about the Himalaya, which I already had throughout the entire day, until we finally arrived at the fairgrounds. My father parked at the main parking lot just like the last time we went. We got out of the car and started heading down the main gate. My cousins were talking about the other thrill rides they had ridden, like the Skydiver, the Gravitron, and the Zipper, which I definitely wasn't ready for. But I was already too busy looking forward to riding the Himalaya. I usually make the Himalaya the highlight of my night, but this time I decided to ride it first thing to make up for the nights I couldn't make it to the fair. My cousin Lorena volunteered to ride the Himalaya with me, so we immediately went up the stairs on the side of the ride and took the first seat that was closer to us. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the oh-so-familiar voice of the DJ and his crazy remarks told us over the microphone, "Hey, you can't sit there. That's the bald people section." We immediately got up as we laughed at what he had just said over the microphone, and we looked for one of the other workers to show us to our seat. For the first time, I was the one who was going to get squeezed. Finally, the ride started. I braced myself because I knew I was going to get squashed for the first time in my life. It wasn't that bad when we went backwards, but I ended up getting the worst of it when it went forward. And this time, I was the one yelling, "Scoot over, you're squishing me!" After the sign wailed for the last time, the ride finally ended. After the ride on the Himalaya, we started to split up. I went with my father, and my 3 cousins went on our way so they can ride on everything they wanted to ride. We walked around, and I went on some of the other usual rides. Later that evening, we all met back at the Himalaya and decided to call it a night. We started leaving the fair, and I looked back at the Himalaya for the last time that year. As we left the fairgrounds, fireworks started going off while we all watched as the last night of the fair wound down for the year. A month later, my mother made plans for us to go on another trip to Ocean City, Maryland, and I was on board as usual because I was going to see the Himalaya again at Trimper's Amusement Park, and this time, I was going to make an effort to ride the Himalaya all by myself. So that Sunday, we packed up some refreshments for Cameron and me, and we started heading down to the resort town. On that long road to Ocean City, Maryland, I just couldn't help but think about their Himalaya and riding it by myself for the first time. I was very nervous, but I was ready to become more independent when it came to riding my favorite ride. As soon as we arrived, I looked at the park and saw the Himalaya sitting at its usual spot. We got out of the car and stretched our legs and began to walk around the boardwalk for a while. After visiting a few stores, we started going to the amusement park, and the Himalaya was the first ride I went to. It was kind of funny because at the fair, I would normally make the Himalaya my last ride, but at the beach, it was the opposite. I went to the Himalaya, and the worker asked me if I wanted to ride by myself. I answered, yeah. The worker showed me to a seat which I had all to myself as my mother got her camera ready. While waiting for some other riders to come aboard, I took the time to look around the ride at the painted scenery, which I hadn't really given myself a chance to during the last time I rode this particular Himalaya ride. In the center of the painted scenery on the tunnel was a downhill skier with a number 8 printed on the front of his suit. The top of the tunnel on this Himalaya had lighted snowflake decorations that sequentially flashed in sync to the music that was playing on the ride system. On the left of the painted scenery was a lady wearing nothing but a necklace underneath a green fur coat, who was about to throw a snowball at a couple painted on the other side of the tunnel. But it looked like the guy was already hit by one snowball because he already had a big glob of snow in his hair. The inside of this particular Himalaya had all these spotlights hanging in the trussing from the rafters. 2 of the spotlights had rotating wheels that had colored gels on them with 6 different colors on the actual wheel. The wheels turned past the light, changing the painted scenery from white to red to blue to green to pink to yellow. This Himalaya had a giant mirror ball just like any other one, but it also had a smaller mirror ball hanging from the center of the ride. This ball was designed to spin vertically with its own spotlights hanging in the back of the ball, which would perform a snowfall. Unfortunately, it was during the day, so I couldn't see any of the lights work, but I really admired the way the big mirror ball reflected from the red and black top canvas. Finally, it was time for the ride to start. As the ride began to move, I looked at the painted artwork inside the tunnel. On the left side of the ride, inside the tunnel entrance, there was a blonde female skier wearing a green and yellow sweater over a blue and yellow ski suit. Skiing beside her was a guy wearing a red and yellow ski suit. He was also wearing a shirt over his ski suit that happened to say Himalaya on it, which was printed in big green letters. The right side of the scenery inside the tunnel had 3 female ice skaters. I suddenly looked up and noticed that this Himalaya also had a strobe light, which was installed in the back of this tunnel, just like the Himalaya at the fair, but there wasn't a siren on this one. As the ride went backwards, it started to pick up more speed until it was time to slow down and take us the other way. As the ride started to go forward, I was feeling a lot more independent because I had never been on a big ride by myself before, besides the swings. Suddenly, the ride started going faster and faster by the moment. As the Himalaya reached top speed, I was having the time of my life riding it alone for once. I felt like I had reached another milestone in my little Himalaya world. In reality, I had reached a milestone on my way from childhood to adulthood. After riding the Himalaya solo for the first time in my life, I went on a couple of rides that were inside the building, which were basically kiddie and family rides. Afterwards, we started heading back to the boardwalk, going to a few more stores and buying some candy from the candy shops. Hours later, it was time to head back down that long road to Dover, Delaware. As soon as we went back home, one of my friends who lived next to me was playing outside, and I told him about my first experience riding the Himalaya in Ocean City by myself. He was amazed, and we talked some more and played around for an hour or so before calling it a day. Over the next week or so, my mother went to run some errands and to get the photos developed from that day we went to Ocean City. As soon as she had the photos, I immediately started looking for the picture of me on the Himalaya. The picture showed the whole entire inside of the ride, the tunnel, the mirror ball, everything. I was pretty stoked about how the picture turned out, and I kept staring at it all day long. I never left it out of my sight. I pretty much took that one photo everywhere I went. That following Saturday morning, my father called asking me if I wanted to hang out with him for the day. So I got dressed and he came by an hour later to pick me up. When we left, my mother suddenly told me not to ask my father to buy me a new toy every time I was with him. My father agreed to keep his promise to my mother as we left the house. One of the many stops we went to was the Ames department store, which was in Milford at the time, to purchase some air fresheners for his car. As we went to the auto department, I found something truly amazing. This store actually sold those mirror balls that were so small you can hang one from your rearview mirror in your car. As soon as they first caught my eye, I felt my prayers had been answered, because all I could think about was to finally having a real mirror ball to use for my model for a change. Not only those mirror balls small enough to hang from your car mirror, but the reflecting pieces were the perfect size to use for my personal project. Immediately, I pointed them out to my father, hoping he would buy one for me. But unfortunately, he denied my request and reminded me that I wasn't allowed to have any kind of new toy for a while. No matter how much I begged and pleaded with him, he just wouldn't give in. After he paid for his new items, we left the store, a small bag in his hand and me carrying nothing but tears. My father tried his best to make me feel better. He tried to say things to make me laugh, but all I could think about that whole day was missing out on a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity of actually having a real mirror ball reflecting my model, making it more like the real thing. Later that evening, after my father brought me back home, I immediately told my mother about those small mirror balls I had spotted at the store earlier that day. I explained that I wanted one of those mirror balls for my Himalaya model while they still exist, because I felt that if I didn't act soon, I may not see them around anymore. The following week, I went with my mother to do some shopping, and we ended up going to another department store where I was seeking another opportunity to get one of those mirror balls for my model. I was determined to get my hands on one of those reflecting beauties after they had been on my mind ever since that Saturday. So I asked my mother if I could see if this store carried those mirror balls. I told her I saw them over in the auto department in the aisle where they sold the air fresheners and other hanging decor. We started heading over to the auto department, and there they were. Those same 3-inch mirror balls I had seen in Milford that previous Saturday, which were about $5 each, the same price they were at the other store. After constantly bugging my mother about it all weekend, she finally bought one of those mirror balls for me. My mother may not have wanted to spoil me rotten, but I think she knew I had some kind of special gift ever since she saw the first model I had built. She knew I was very passionate when it came to the Himalaya ride, and she started to realize that I had such drive, especially at an early age. Now that I finally had a real mirror ball to use, I made an attempt to create a better looking Himalaya model. This time I wanted to copy the artwork of the Himalaya in Ocean City, Maryland. I even colored the canvas with red and black markers, but I only colored the side of the roof that would be facing down inside the model, so the mirror ball could reflect from the roof, just like the real Himalaya in Ocean City. After spending hours copying the artwork and assembling the model, I took the 3-inch mirror ball out of the pack and set it in the center of the turntable. I used a flashlight to shine on the mirror ball as the model spun around. I also used my own color wheel light, which Aunt Christine had given me a few birthdays ago. The same type of color wheel light that was used on the Himalaya in Ocean City, but a house version. I set the light about 2 feet away in front of the model and turned it on to see my model change in many different colors as the car spun. I turned on the radio and played with my newly built model for hours every day, at least until I started to have more ideas to create a better one. The next month, school started again, and another summer had come and gone. I continued to play with my model and to get myself through the fall and winter seasons. And there you have it. That was chapter 5 for my book, The Himalaya, with the strobe flashes and the mirror ball spins. Hope you enjoyed it so far. Be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel and let me know what you think. And if you'd like to buy my book, you can buy it from Amazon or my online store, along with tons of fan-based merch. I'll be back on here next month with chapter 6. So until then, as we say in the Himalaya world, keep that mirror ball spinning. Take care.